So, let's talk about Dungeons & Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, and maybe a little about Top Gun Maverick. So, two things before we begin. There will be spoilers for these two movies, so if you don't want to have those ruined for you, then I suggest you stop watching. Secondly, you don't really have to watch this video, you can just treat it like a podcast, because there's not going to be a whole lot of relevant video in this video. You see, I'm really wary of putting movie footage into my videos because it can very easily get your videos copyright claimed. Sometimes you can avoid it if your clips are less than 10 seconds, but sometimes you can't. Yes, you can try to dispute it, you can try to claim fair use, but the person that decides whether your complaint is valid is the same person who's making the claim. It's like letting your ex-wife determine what your alimony payment should be. It's just not worth the hassle. So, without further ado, let's talk about Honor Among Thieves. My god, what a breath of fresh air this movie was. It's like someone looked at me and said, you know, let's make a fantasy movie that has none of the things that he hates. So, what makes this movie great? Well, first of all, you do not need to have any knowledge of Dungeons & Dragons to enjoy it. You do not need to know who the Red Wizards are or who the Harpers are, because at its core, this is simply a heist film. But there are a lot of things that, if you are familiar with D&D, you can point out, like, oh, that's Autoluke's Resilient Sphere, or that's Meteor Swarm, or that's Everard's Black Tentacles. But it's not necessary to enjoy this film. Secondly, this movie actually has colors that are not gray and blue, because goddamn, I am so sick of fantasy films and TV shows and historical dramas covering everything in this blue-gray color filter because, oh, if it's set in the Middle Ages or a fantasy Middle Ages, it has to be dreary and depressing, right? And not only that, the movie is actually well lit. I don't know why, but so many movies and a lot of TV shows are really dim, and I don't know why. Is it just a stylistic trend that filmmakers have adopted, or is lighting just one of those lost arts these days? Or maybe it's because with a shift from film to digital cameras tend to pick up details from the shadows better than film can, so maybe they've just adjusted the lighting to take that into account. I don't know, but it sucks. And this movie is, you can actually see things. But the best thing by far about Honor Among Thieves is its sincerity. In sociology, there's this concept called cultural cringe, where people feel that their culture's products are inferior and worthless, and then just decide to go and consume the products of another culture, typically, say, the United States. I mean, here in Canada, that's basically a pillar of our national identity right there. Well, I found that fantasy and genre fiction in general tends to suffer from something similar. I like to call it genre cringe, because fantasy for a long time has sort of been consigned to a literary ghetto. I mean, sure, maybe Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, maybe those guys' works can be considered to have artistic merit, but for the most part, fantasy is usually just derided as just escapism for socially maladjusted men, or being little more than an array of D&D and Tolkien clones. And I can't help but feel that a lot of authors kind of developed a complex about this, like, oh, our genre isn't respected, we need to find a way to make it respectable, so how do we do that? Well, there are two ways I've seen fantasy authors tackle this problem. The first is to make their works grim dark, because if it's dark and edgy and gritty, then obviously it has more artistic worth than something that's all sunshine and rainbows, right? And in the 2000s, there was this whole glut of fantasy authors striving to out-grimdark each other, whether it was Joe Abercrombie or R. Scott Bakker or Richard Morgan. The other way that authors try to assuage their genre cringe is to engage in, for lack of a better term, this sort of meta-mockery of genre conventions where it's almost like you're making fun of yourself in the hopes that people won't make fun of you. Have you ever noticed that sometimes when children are being bullied in school, they'll often adopt very negative self-talk and constantly put themselves down, as if to say, there's nothing you can say to me that's worse than what I say to myself? That's what a lot of fantasy and genre fiction in general felt like for a good long time. I think a good example of this would be Dragon Age Origins, where very early in the game, you're introduced to King Kalen, who is obviously written to sound like the cliched high fantasy hero riding into battle against a tainted god. Glorious! And then he dies horribly a short while later. It's as if the writers are telling the player specifically, you see, we're not like those other fantasy settings. You know, it's so brutal, it's so dark and brutal here that the typical high fantasy hero wouldn't last 5 minutes. That's how brutal it is. And isn't it ironic? Isn't it incredibly ironic that this guy, he was like introduced as being this big ultimate hero, but he dies horribly? Isn't it like super ironic? Come on, you understand what I'm talking about, right? Or how about the way Dragon Age treats its elves? It's like the writers are saying, hey, I know what you're saying, I know what you're gonna say, I know you're gonna make fun of us for using elves because they're a cliche, but wait, our elves are different. They're not proud and beautiful, they're dirty and downtrodden and oppressed, and in Dragon Age Inquisition, your elven party member isn't beautiful, she's ugly and foul-mouthed and boorish. See, we've subverted the tropes, we're different, we're not like other girls. Here is a quote from the book The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, if you want an example of what I'm talking about. "How is the book?" asked Giselle. "The Fall of the Master Maker in 3 volumes. They say it's one of the great classics of history." "Lot of boring rubbish," she snorted derisively. "Full of wise magi, stern knights with mighty swords, and ladies with mightier bosoms. Magic, violence, and romance in equal measure. Utter shit." She slapped the book off the table and it tumbled onto the carpet, pages flapping. "There must be something you can find to keep busy?" "Really? What would you suggest?" "My cousins do a lot of embroidery." "Fuck yourself." And when they're not mocking themselves or their genre, a lot of writers will do this kind of, fourth wall breaking quippiness and mockery, as if the characters know they're in a movie and they know how ridiculous their situation is, so they're pointing it out so that people in the audience can't make fun of them. A while back there was this meme on Twitter about what if classic movies were written by Joss Whedon. So in Silence of the Lambs you have, "I'm sorry, you said your name was Hannibal and you're a cannibal? Little on the nose, don't you think? That's like if your parents named you Dr. Eats People." Or the chestburster scene in Alien. "Talk about getting something off your chest. Someone let Mother know that next time a creepy derelict ship sends out a transmission, I'll stay in hypersleep. Thanks." And the Dungeons and Dragons film doesn't do this. There's no irony here. There's no mockery of fantasy cliches or mockery of fantasy conventions. It's not trying to tell you that it's not like other girls. The paladin isn't revealed to be a huge jerk at the end or a raging hypocrite. In fact, there's even one point where he says something like, "Irony is a blade that often wounds the hand that wields it," as if the writers are acknowledging how overly irony-poisoned entertainment has become. There's no moment where a character says, "Looks like we escaped the dungeon and the dragon," and then the dragon rears up in the background and he says, "It's behind me, isn't it?" No, there's nothing like that. I think the one moment that defined this film is when the barbarian Holga goes to visit, I think it's her ex-husband, and she finds out that in the time that she's been in prison, he's moved on and found someone else. So she's feeling kind of depressed, and then the bard Elgin tries to cheer her up with a song, and I was so primed by years upon years of edgy, cynical, irony-drenched genre fiction, I expected her to roll her eyes and make some snarky, condescending remark, or just take his lute and beat him over the head with it, but no. She just smiles and joins in with the song, and it's a great moment. Because again, there's no irony here, there's no snarkiness, there's no quippiness, and when the movie does actually do humor, it usually works. Or how about that whole subplot with Simon the Sorcerer? He has to learn how to believe in himself before he can attune to the Helmet of Disjunction. And I'm sure a lot of people might go, "He has to learn to believe in himself? That's so lame." But it works, what can I say? And there's a lot of great moments in this film that feel like something that could have come right out of a tabletop game, and they never feel artificial. Like, there's this one scene where the paladin explains this extremely complicated puzzle on a bridge, but then, Simon accidentally steps on the wrong tile and it collapses, and then he discovers, there's this rod I found that lets me teleport. That feels like something ripped right out of a tabletop game where the DM comes up with this incredibly complicated puzzle, but then one of the players ruins it, so he has to think up some solution out of the blue. Alright, so I've talked enough about D&D Honor Among Thieves. Now I want to talk briefly about Top Gun Maverick. Very different movie, but again, I enjoyed it for the same reason that I enjoyed Honor Among Thieves, and that is its sincerity. I went into this movie with a lot of skepticism. I was thinking, a sequel to Top Gun? Did anyone really want this? This is just going to be nostalgia bait, alright? And in a post-war on terror, post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan world, could you really make a movie where the US military is presented in an unambiguously good light? And I have heard people say that Top Gun Maverick is a propaganda film, and I suppose it is because I'm having a propaganda at Jennifer Connelly. Alright, sure, maybe there's something to this argument, but I think the real motivation behind making Top Gun Maverick is simply that, fighter jets are cool and the people who fly them are cool, and if you have a problem with that, then too bad, go away. But again, what makes the film work is its sincerity. There's no irony, there's no edginess, for lack of a better word. There's no moment where it's revealed that the good guys are actually the bad guys and that the Americans have been committing war crimes, and then the screenwriter and the director simultaneously jerk each other off about how subversive and clever they are. No, there's nothing like that. And because the movie embraces sincerity, at the end, when Maverick finally gets put back into the cockpit of an F-14 Tomcat, it feels like the movie earned that moment. It's not just simply nostalgia bait. It's not them going, hey, do you remember the 80s? Because he's doing the same thing he did back in the 80s. No, it felt earned. And speaking of the 80s, I think the sincerity of Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, I think that's why people say it felt like a fantasy movie from the 80s, because back in the 80s, there was a lot less of that, irony-poisoned, subverting tropes nonsense that's just become endemic over the past decade or so. And I really hope that we see more movies like this. Unfortunately, I don't think the Dungeons & Dragons film did very well at the box office, so whether or not we'll get a sequel, it's probably up in the air. Anyway, that's all I have to say. See you later, everyone.